Good morning. Welcome to the garden. I'm glad you're here with us today. I think that probably answers the question, so we can just go home now. Because part of this theme this morning came from some questions I've gotten recently about what the garden believes about this tenet or that tenet of the faith. And I guess they're really asking what I believe, since I do most of the talking around here. And so I've tried to share that a little bit. We've done it in bits and pieces, I suppose. But today I thought it's not going to be comprehensive by any means, but try to kind of give you the big picture of what we're kind of where we find ourselves, and I guess where I find myself, and that realizing that we can be anywhere. Oops, is that me? You're waiting for me? Okay, I'm sorry. You're going to have to put up with some croakiness this morning. So that where I am doesn't mean that's where you are or have to be. We're all very different. We're on different parts of the journey. But I'll at least share with you kind of the big picture of the garden in terms of where we are in terms of the Christian faith. If you've been around the garden for a while, you're probably aware that I have sort of what we might call an ambiguous relationship with the church. I'm very grateful for the church and the ways in which it has nurtured me and launched me into my spiritual journey. But at the same time, I'm frustrated with the church, and I struggle with the church and organized religion in general. And mostly I struggle with certain parts of the church that insist that there's only one way to believe. It has to be this way. This is the right way, and nothing else qualifies as Christian. And I just can't buy that. I just don't agree with that. I'll tell you, though, I think maybe once I did, and I wish I could, because it seems like it would be a lot easier if I just went along with things instead of always kind of pushing against. But I guess I'm just a skeptic at heart, and it's really a hard thing for me to do. And I just have too many questions to kind of blindly assent to whatever anybody else says. Well, it's been helpful to me as I've read and studied and prayed about this to find others who are going through a similar kind of struggle. For instance, I just finished reading Barbara Brown Taylor's book, Learning to Walk in the Dark. And one of the things she talks about is that she's talking about the slippage, she calls it, of her ideas about God. And she says this: the big chest I used to keep them in is smaller than a shoebox now. And I can really resonate with that. In fact, I remember for myself when a colleague of mine said that he had just this little core of key beliefs that were his, that he held on to. And I have a core, it's not very big at all, of essentials, and a lot of other things I've kind of moved aside. And so I can also really identify with Brown Taylor when she says this: I do not believe I'm describing a loss of faith in God here. Instead, I believe I'm describing a loss of faith in the system that promised to help me grasp God. That is, for me, the church, that tried to help us grasp who God is, what God is like. And I guess part of my fear is that in some ways the church shortchanges us when it comes to our spiritual life and our spiritual growth. Because there is this perspective that if we can sign on the bottom line and nod our heads in agreement with this dogma or this lingo or this way of saying or this way of doing something, we're in, we're there, we've arrived. And one, I can't do that, and two, I'm not sure we ever arrive. It seems to me that life is a continuous journey and that we're always experiencing new things and having new understandings. And so it just keeps growing and changing as we grow and change our way through life. Recently, I was reminded of a work by James Fowler that came out early when I was in seminary. So it's getting pretty dated these days. It's called Stages of Faith. And Fowler figured out, or he thought, that there were 6 stages of faith development, and kind of tried to describe what those were, at least except for the last 2, he tried to describe them. The very first one was what he called that early childhood, that very simple faith that little children seem to have, which may be the best faith there is as far as we know. The second one he talks about is the more literal faith of school-age children, where they take everything as true and factual and real. And then there's that sort of conventional faith that adolescents usually have inherited and hold on to. And then there's the faith of early adulthood, And very often, Fowler says that's where we stop. We kind of stay there, or at least put it on a long pause for a lot of our lives. And then he talks about the last two stages, which are not ones that are described as easily. They're a little more nebulous, I suppose. And he says that they can only occur after we experience what he calls the sacrament of defeat. What that means is we've experienced the ups and downs and all the curves and the twists and turns that occur in the course of life. And his comment is that we probably wouldn't experience that until sometime after midlife. So maybe that's where I am, because I'm certainly midlife or after at this point in my life. So, maybe that's part of the reason I have some of these questions. But what happens when we get to those last two stages that he talks about is that it's a new place to be. And the church doesn't address that place or even acknowledge that it exists, that there can be other ways of thinking and other ways of believing. And at the same time, that's the reason for my struggle. And at the same time, the church is often seen as hypocritical and judgmental when it comes to others. And it's got kind of a bad rap in a lot of ways. And it insists very often, the church as a whole insists that only orthodox belief is valid. And the problem I have with that is that I kind of have a sense of where this orthodox belief came from. Now, we've talked about this before, but let's just start with the Bible. Most scholars have explained to us and tried to help us understand that the Bible was written by human beings. And I would guess those folks were not much different from you and me. They were trying to kind of explore an understanding of who God is, what life is like, who Jesus was. And they tried to express that was in a way that fit their time and their place in life and in the world. And so they write that. And I've just finished, well, I'm not finished yet, but I'm still rereading Elaine Pagels' book called The Gnostic Gospels. One of the things Pagels points out is in the first couple centuries, really, of Christianity, in the early centuries, there was a depth and breadth of belief. They were all over the place that were considered okay. They abided side by side. They were different. There were modifications of them. But then in the 4th and 5th centuries is when these councils came into being. And I have to tell you that in my perspective of the councils, it's more that it was about power and politics than a prayerful gathering of the faithful. Because this is the group that tried to canonize Scripture or standardize it, saying this fit, this didn't. So some of those other writings that were abounding at the time were thrown out. They were rejected. The dominant party won, if you will. And only the beliefs that they liked were the ones that stayed in and that were accepted. And so that's how we're left with what's called orthodoxy. Now, actually, heresy, the word heresy, didn't even exist prior to those councils. But they were the ones that named those things heretical. And I suppose I'd probably fall in the camp of being a heretic. And the other problem I have with this standardization of the Bible and the standardization of the faith is that it doesn't make any room for what I call continuing revelation. There is the sense that everything there was to know about God has been said and done and is encased in Scripture. It's there, it's it, and what these authorities said about what was right and what wasn't, that it's all said and done. And, I just can't believe that. Because it seems to me that God is still very active in our world. It's still being revealed in our world. And we need to honor that and pay some attention to it. I was talking about this with one of our band members not long ago. And he said, the last page of the Bible doesn't have the words "the end" on it. Maybe we should write a sequel. Well, I'm not sure that's going to happen. But part 2, might be something worth considering to see how we come up with it there. But I think that the problem I have is that many times people buy hook, line, and sinker what some authority figure or what the church says is true and real, not really knowing or believing whether it is true or real for them. Hildegard of Bingen said, "We cannot live in a world that is interpreted for us by others." And indeed, that's true. that isn't the world for us, that it's not the world in which we live now, this world that's incredibly diverse. Well, I guess all in all, we'd have to say that Christianity does come with a lot of baggage. A lot of people, really don't have a lot of respect for the Christian faith. And it doesn't always have a good reputation out in the world. And I guess that's one of the things I would say about where we are as the garden. The garden in some ways tries to counteract a closed, rigid set of beliefs by saying that wherever we are is okay. When we started the garden almost 19 years ago now, the group that decided they wanted to try to design what might happen on Sunday mornings tried to figure out what the basics were. In the process of talking about that, we mostly discarded things like dogma and doctrine and creeds, and instead discovered for ourselves at least what we thought we could say was really real and true. And that was the unconditional love of God that we can see witnessed in the life of Jesus. And that's what we try to hold on to. That's what's really important, that everyone is loved by God. Everyone is a part of the family of God. Some of you may remember that, half a dozen years ago or so, we had a workshop that was put together by Bob Blake that was called our Spiritual Statement Workshop, where people gathered together and we talked about various tenets of the faith, and people tried to consider where they were on this particular thing or that one at any given time. And the whole experience culminated in people writing their own spiritual statement. In fact, I think there's a book out in the lobby on the table out there that is called The Evolving Spiritual Statements. And we deliberately used the word evolving because we're not assuming that what we said 5 years ago is the same place where we are today. And so it's a matter of really trying to acknowledge that it changes, it grows as we change and grow in life. That workshop has been turned into an online model now that you can access through the Garden website at thegardenonline.org and click on What I Really Believe and can actually go through those things. I still would like to see us resurrect the face-to-face kind of experience because I think that's helpful. I guess what I'm saying is that I know folks here at the Garden are all over the place theologically. Some people have had a lot of religious experience, church experience. Some have had very little or nothing at all, and that's okay. We're all kind of on this journey and kind of evolving, so we don't expect anybody to be any certain place. What we want you to know is you're welcome here. Everybody is loved by God, accepted by God. We're all part of God's family here. And so we can be wherever we are, and that's okay. The key thing, I think, is what I said, that unconditional love of God. Jesus said himself that it was the most important thing for us. And that's what comes from our Bible passage for today. This is out of Mark's Gospel, which is the first gospel written, and this is how this version reads. A teacher of the law was there who heard the discussion. He saw that Jesus had given the Sadducees a good answer, so he came to him with a question. Which commandment is the most important of all? Jesus replied, the most important one is this. Listen, Israel, the Lord our God is the only Lord. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second most important commandment is this. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. There is no other commandment more important than these two. Well, hearing that causes me to wonder if maybe we're not asking the right question. Maybe instead of asking, what do we believe, we should be asking ourselves, how loving are we?